podcast. I'm super excited to chat with you today and hear your story.
Thank you so much for having me.
Misty, so one of my first questions I always ask my guests is give our audience a little bit of a snapshot of kind of who you are, what's your story, and when it comes to your career, and what is it that you're doing today?
So I am a content producer. I've been working in the television industry for more than a decade. I live in Los Angeles, and um, my story is kind of an interesting one. I actually grew up quite poor in Florida, nowhere near the television industry, nowhere near Hollywood. I did not know anyone. But I kind of had the bug to work in Hollywood and work in entertainment from a very young age. And even though I studied science in college, I always had kind of moving to Los Angeles and Hollywood in the back of my mind. So I worked my way through college as a bartender, as a waitress, as a jello shot girl at a bowling alley. And I eventually saved up enough money after I graduated to move to Los Angeles. And through a lot of hustle and just knocking on doors and putting in a lot of hard work, I landed my first job as an assistant at Lionsgate Television. It's a studio here that makes, at the time that I was working there, made shows like Mad Men, Weeds, Nurse Jackie, things like that. And it was through that first job that it was really boot camp for television. And I worked as an assistant on various desks, as we say in the business, for about 6 or 7 years. I kind of went from working as an assistant in television development to working as a writer's assistant. I worked on Orange is the New Black for the first 4 seasons as a showrunner's assistant. I worked on a show called The Fosters for Freeform. And it was through all of these experiences that I discovered my love of television writing. And so I practiced my craft. I took a lot of courses. I wrote a lot of scripts on my own. I put in the reps, I put in the work. And eventually I got an agent and a manager. Um, and I really, over the course of like 7 or 8 years, was finally starting to get to the destination that I thought I had always wanted in TV. And I remember I had a writing partner at the time, and we took out this original TV show idea that we loved, and we had Warner Brothers attached, and we worked on it for 18 months on the pitch, going back and forth. And we ended up pitching it to 9 different networks. And while we got super, super close and all the feedback was great, we ultimately did not sell it. And in an afternoon, all of this work that I had done for 18 months kind of disappeared, and it was work for free, and the project just went away. And it made me really reconsider kind of an entire decade in television and what was I doing. But basically the pandemic happened, and like so many of us, I really had, without distractions around, to kind of supplement, any unhappiness I was feeling. It was really clear to me that I was frustrated with television and frustrated with the path I had chosen. And with a lot of therapy, soul searching, long talks with friends, I realized that I didn't like basically the structure of how my entire industry was set up, and the fact that there are gatekeepers everywhere that you have to try and convince to practice your craft, that you're asked to do hundreds of hours of work for free with no guarantee that you will ever see the fruits of that labor or be compensated literally in any way. And while I have quite a high tolerance for discomfort, having a carrot kind of dangled in front of me for more than a decade just wasn't something I was willing to tolerate anymore. So, yeah, that's like the sort of the beginning arc of how I started in Hollywood and then up to the point where I was considering, is this working anymore?
Hmm. And so what happened after that when you're like, "Okay, this is not working, it's time to make a change." What was it that you were like, what was your next step? Because I think this is so relevant to so many people. I think
Mhm.
a lot of people went through a pandemic, but in my industry, like in talent development, we see this for decades. We've seen this people looking for change and etc. So what was your next step at that point?
So I'm wondering how many of your listeners can relate to this because so the way I used to operate is when I have a vision for my life, I get attached to that vision. And I really had this narrative that was like the only way I can be happy is to have this very specific career in this very specific part of the world. And that's it. Any other version of my life would be a failure, or I would feel like I was giving up. So this narrative was a really powerful driving force that held me back for a long time. And also just the thought of like, what would folks in my industry think of me if
Mhm,
I left? Especially in Los Angeles, there's this idea of like, if somebody moves back to where they came from or they leave Los Angeles because they're like, I want a house and a family and I
mhm,
don't want it to cost $2 million for me to have a modest house. There was this kind of aura that was like, oh, they couldn't cut it, they
mhm,
couldn't hack it. So something that really helped tip the scales for me is when I learned about this idea of delivery systems. So, stop me if you've heard this before, but basically, if you were to sit down and make a list of all your talents and the things you enjoy doing, or even the things you enjoy doing in your current position, um, you could then look at those gifts through the lens of different delivery systems. So, I'll break it down for you.
mhm,
What I loved about writing is I got to get into the psyche of why people do what they do. I
mhm,
got to watch complicated characters or create complicated characters um, who really got to dig deep within themselves and find better versions of themselves or fight for what they believed in. I liked the autonomy of writing. I liked that I got to use my emotional intelligence to move someone to feel motivated or seen. And so I kind of made a list, and this was with the help of a career coach and some friends. I made a list of the things that I felt were my gifts and the things I enjoyed. And then I had to take some time away from it and had to ask for outside help because I think we can't always see ourselves as clearly as we think we can. And I really asked myself, well, are there other delivery systems for these gifts, for the things I like to do? I also made a list of pain points,
mhm,
and pain points are like, okay, things I don't like about what I'm currently doing or the industry I'm in, like those gatekeepers, right? Like the high barrier to entry. So, for example, if I love watching people overcome struggles, if I love understanding why people do what they do, and these are some of my interests or my gifts, I could look into going to school to become a therapist. I could look into becoming a coach, right? I could look into helping other people write their stories. I could look into working in an HR department.
mhm,
So just really kind of, and by the way, like this is such a succinct version of this, but like untangling the identity, that we've built for ourselves or the idea of what we should be doing. And I hate that word should, but I absolutely find myself, still tangled in it, even though I'm consciously trying not to do that. All the while I'm going like, oh, okay, how do I gently imagine new possibilities for myself, new delivery systems for myself? How do I really get in touch with my gifts and what makes me happy? Um, and so what I did with that slow kind of examination, I finally realized, and this was the scariest step for me, but that the best possible thing I could do was to stop racing full steam ahead to try and set down this ticking clock narrative that I think so many of us have, especially as women, of like, oh, okay, I'm 31, I'm 32, I'm 34, I'm turning 35. What do I want my life to look like? And instead of trying to force it into something, to be a little bit more in conversation with the opportunities around me and let life unfold.
Mm,
So I was lucky enough to have kind of a spiritual mentor. Here in Los Angeles, there's there's a lot of opportunity for some deep spiritual conversations. And she really helped me see that the best thing I could do for my life, for my career, for anything was to stop and just live.
mm,
And this doesn't mean don't work. This doesn't mean don't pay the bills, but just approaching it in a different way of going, you know what? I can take a job that doesn't have to mean anything at all or everything, right? Like I can take a job that pays the bills, that keeps me stable, um, and really just live life. So now at the point in my timeline that I'm speaking about now was right after everyone got vaccinated, here in the US. And for the first time, the world was kind of opening back up, and it felt like there was some semblance of safety with the vaccine, and we could travel and not die from COVID. And um, I learned about a program called Remote Year. Remote Year is a work and travel program where you travel with the same community for a certain amount of time. I signed up for a 4-month trip. They also have 1-month trips and 12-month trips.
mm,
But basically, I signed up for a 4-month program, and it meant that I traveled with the same community for 4 months in Latin America. And every month we moved to a new country. Now, what Remote Year provides is accommodations, 24/7, access to a co working space. The whole point is they set you up with the support you need to work remotely if you're lucky enough to have a job that works remotely. And of course, in the pandemic, um, just about everything, except for hospitals, grocery workers, service workers, was remote.
right.
And my industry went remote for the first time, which was incredible. Like the television industry never, ever um, would have been remote if COVID hadn't happened. So I suddenly, by following my gut instincts, even though it was terrifying, found myself living and working in Latin America. And because I wasn't putting as much pressure on myself to like stay in and say no to life so that I could write all the scripts I possibly could, slowly over the course of these 4 months and just getting to really shake up my routine and my identity, I was able to not only imagine, but experience an entirely different version of life. So suddenly I found myself living in Antigua, Guatemala, hiking volcanoes on the weekend, or doing volunteer work, learning Spanish, and realizing for me, what I really needed was to realize that my teeny tiny view of life I'd created of like, I can only be happy if I am living as a working writer in Los Angeles. Um, it dissolved. It dissolved through experience. And for me, I needed something as intense as living in Latin America
Mm,
for for 4 months. And so I actually ended up traveling a bit after the program ended, and I found totally new identity pillars through this. So I now had a community that I could travel with. I had 22 new dear friends. I spoke Spanish now. Like I just was able to expand my identity outside of my career and understand who I was other than just my job.
Mm,
So cultivating more identity pillars was really helpful because it allowed me to step away from my, um, to kind of kick away the Hollywood career identity pillar, and my house didn't collapse.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you know what? I love the concept of delivery systems that you mentioned as well. I think just finding something that you enjoy and understanding what you enjoy, what drives you, what drains you is super important. And to your point, a lot of people feel the same way that you feel in terms of like they feel like if I don't do this, I'm not gonna be that does, success to them was this thing. Like it was this thing that
Yeah.
they described. But in fact, I guess part of it is thanks to the pandemic, it really allowed us to take a moment to think
Mm,
ourselves like what else can I be doing, especially for individuals who've lost their jobs. Again, I mean, I'm not trying to
yes.
find a silver lining, but if there was one, that would probably be it. And I think just taking that pause and recognizing that there's in today's world and access, there's so many things that we can do that we enjoy and we can still monetize and that still give us that purpose. And so I think
Yeah.
so I think it's very spot on. Again, I think it's very relevant to people and maybe in different kind of levels that people experience. But it's a lot of people I talk to have kind of gone through similar journeys as yourself. But I'm curious. Because travel seems to be, and I mean, for some people, yes, they can afford and to do that and to travel, etc. And I've had many friends that done that, but and I don't think it's necessarily travel internationally, but I think it's just stepping out of your like what do you think it is that helped you the most stepping out of that environment, out of your little bubble, if you want to call it that, because we all have bubbles we live in, what you know what I mean? So and I think it's just stepping out of that bubble no matter how far or how you go. But what do you think about travel and being in a different space that really kind of you're like, huh, this I kind of starting to learn about myself a little bit more.
I love this question, and I love that you called out what a privilege it is to travel because also, like I mentioned at the start of this episode, like I grew up really poor. I really never had an opportunity to travel until I was like in my mid 30s and had savings from years of working, and I know that that's not an opportunity that everybody gets to have. And so really, when we're looking at changes in our lives, I think there's two huge things that hold us back. The first one is just fear, like fear of failure,
Mm,
fear of losing everything. And if you follow the fear far enough down the path, it's usually ends up with "and I'll die alone." Right? If we keep asking ourselves, well, why is that so bad? Why is that so bad? Like, I'll fail. Why is that so bad? Well, then nobody will hire me again. Well, why is that so bad? Then I won't have a job. I'll be destitute. Why is that so bad? Then I'll be homeless. Why is that so bad? I'll die alone, like on the street alone. So I think fear is the first thing. And then I think the second thing is an identity crisis. I think for those of us who struggled to find work in the pandemic, who lost work in the pandemic, or really at any point in our lives, like if our main pillar of how we understand ourselves and relate to the world is work, or I'm a boss, or I manage a team, or I'm a creative, it really can send us into a spiral of, and it can feel very scary and like you're kind of free falling of, well, wait a second, if I don't wake up every day and lead a team of 20,
mm,
who am I? What am I? How do I relate to the world? Where's my value?
mm,
Right? So for me, what travel did, to answer your question, is it pretty much dissolved all of the existing ways that I understood myself to relate to the world. So I no longer had the comfort of my own home, to be in, of like, oh, this is my stuff and this is the way I decorate. I no longer had my closest friends around me. And so there wasn't a shorthand of like, oh, this is who I am in the group. Um, I wasn't going to work every day in the same way that I had been. So I worked for a couple months of the trip, but I'm a freelance producer. So I also didn't work for some of that time. So I had to figure out, like, okay, if I'm not logging on to work every day, how do I spend my days? Like, what is Misty without her job?
Mm,
Who am I if I'm not writing a script every day? You know, when I peel off everything, what am I outside of this kind of mask that I put on all the time? So for me, travel in that kind of extreme way helped me remove everything from my life just about that I identified with. And it also presented lots of new opportunities for me to try and step into and discover something I liked. So, something I never knew I liked before is riding in a hot air balloon. That might sound like a small little thing, but little small moments like that, like, okay, I conquered my fear of heights and I got in this hot air balloon, or I went to Machu Picchu. Like, it helped me solidify, like, okay, I'm an adventurous person. And that's not something I ever could have understood about myself or believed about myself if I hadn't taken the trip I had. But for those listening who are like, good for you, I can't take a 4-month trip at America. I've got kids, I've got, et cetera. Something that was also life changing for me was signing up for dance classes. I love to salsa, I love to bachata. And in Los Angeles, there are really amazing dance studios here. And just signing up for like a 4-week salsa class was amazing. In the pandemic, I took out a really easy, it's Jamie Oliver's Quick and Easy Food. Every recipe in this cookbook just has 5 ingredients. It's for people who don't like to cook, but really like to eat delicious things. And I started cooking, a couple recipes a week. And that started to give me this identity of like, oh, I'm kind of a cook. So now I've got cook and I've got dancer in addition to the other things. So this is just me offering that even in small ways, you can start to play with new sides of yourself, try new things, go to a rock climbing gym, sign up for a comedy class, take a writing class over Zoom, and that these shifts can happen really subtly and gently. It doesn't have to be a giant like, and I'm quitting my job and I'm traveling Latin America, It
yeah.
can kind of be like, I kind of looked back after that trip and I realized I was a totally changed person, but it didn't happen all of a sudden. It happened really gently over a period of months. And it was only when I got back to Los Angeles that I was like, oh, I'm very different.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's and I love that you said it doesn't happen right away because I think that we often, especially when, and to your point as well, we don't know what we don't know. And in order to
Yeah.
discover that unknown, which I think we all have, and which is why it's great to have that soundboard and that mirror and the coaching and the mentoring. But it just takes putting yourself in situations because like with the hot air balloon situation, you never knew you were gonna like that, but until you experience that. And I think that is so important. And also, yeah, like there's, and again, people, I feel like we're, as humans, we always looking for these major changes and these magic formulas, and we keep giving ourselves to, well, I can't afford to do this and I can't do this. But to your point, it doesn't have to be international. For like, I'm in a DC metro area, and this weekend and over the next several weekends, they're doing salsa in front of the Jefferson memorial or a monument.
Oh, that
So
sounds
it's
awesome.
great. And it's like it's just
Yeah.
a group, and they advertise, they're like, come and they teach salsa, and the weather is beautiful right now. So to your point, that it doesn't have to be something this drastic big thing. And sometimes it's just putting yourself, getting yourself out of your typical day and environment, and at whatever level. So some people can kind of jump ship and go that full route, but for some of us it needs a little bit those baby steps. But the idea here is action and experience, and that's what I kind of hear from you. And also, what's interesting is that although you are doing other things, it's still feeding your creative part of you, whether
Mhm.
it's cooking, whether it's dancing. So I think you're probably still feeding that passion for creativity, from the
Mhm.
writing. So have you kind of discovered that it's that creativity that you look for? And you're still writing and doing these things, but like, what has that opened for you?
I love that question. So by the way, what I'm doing now and being back in Los Angeles made me realize that I don't want to pursue television writing in the way that I did before. And I started working at Masterclass. If you know that kind of streaming service, that website, I started working at Masterclass um, as first a creative producer and then a development producer. So I was still getting to use my gifts and even writing in the development process for these classes, but in a totally different way than I had before, in a really supported way at a company that I felt like the mission of, making education accessible to everyone really fit with um my value system. And I was finding that um after my trip, I just had it's the best way I can think to describe it is I was sitting a little bit further back into myself.
Mm,
So the way I approach things, because I had more confidence, I had a larger worldview, I had more playfulness, which I think is something that I was really missing before all of this started. I was so serious about my career and how it's going to go. And I didn't really approach it as an experiment. But um, for me, having experienced a totally different version or versions of what life could look like, I was now I approach work, and I'm actually working in politics right now, helping to produce political content to help get candidates elected, which is wild and really meaningful. But it allowed me to start to view my life in chapters.
mm,
It allowed me to realize, like, hey, things are not that serious or that dire. Once you've seen some of the extreme poverty that I also saw on my trip, it really gave me a lot of perspective just about what success really is, how comfortable my life is compared with so many out there. And so it really allowed me things like that help take the pressure off when I'm going, like, okay, I'm working at masterclass now. This is a chapter in my career and in my life. And when I look around, I realize I am successful. Even if you think you don't have a lot, even if you're looking around your apartment and you're like, I hate this apartment. I want a backyard. I want XYZ, you know, um, and absolutely aim bigger, absolutely have ambitions. But kind of for me, being able to hold this gratitude
mm.
and realizing that, because, people always say, well, somebody out there has it worse. And it's like, once you've seen it and you've spoken with those people, for me, um, it just gave me a little bit more of, can we swear on the podcast?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. It gave me a little bit more like, fuck it. Like, fuck it. Either I know that I'm an adventurous person, and if this doesn't work out,
Mhm.
um, I'm gonna be okay. And again, that is a privileged POV. Like, if you are a person who has a lot of medical debt or kids to support, you can't be
Yeah.
as um as risk taking. So I always want to caveat that and be inclusive. But yeah, it's not that I was doing things that differently, but the way, like, that I was approaching things felt very different. So the actions on the outside of, like, oh, I'm still producing content might have looked the same, but the shift that I had internally was huge. And I also was way better able to set boundaries at work,
Mhm.
whereas I was feeling really burnt out and always like giving other people my power. Now I was like, "Oh, no, like, I need to go to my salsa class. It's a really important part of of my balance. Like, no, I can't work till 8 p.m. I'm so sorry." Period, Like, so yeah, it was more of an internal shift, really.
Mm. Yeah, I relate to part of it as well because so when we started Bestern, our startup in 2019, we were just like tunnel vision, like it has to happen. Like we had an idea for scaling. We were in like 6 different accelerators, like full on working 7 days a week. Like, I mean, no
Mm,
break. And let me tell you, listen, I do more now. I work less. I actually do. I wear more hats, but I work less. I take my proper weekends. I take a vacation, and I cannot tell you how much more productive I am today and chilled out
Yes.
And I think but it's like you have to get, if you would have told me back then, Elaine, and people were telling me, and I'm stubborn. I don't know about you, but I'm stubborn. Like, no, I need to hit burnout. I need to be down there. And then I'm like, okay, maybe it's right. So I'm stubborn and I don't listen well, but for good, good advice, unfortunately, I'm better now. But it's interesting because it's like once you're in that tunnel vision, and you just have to go through certain experiences and there's just no way around it, and for some people it comes sooner than later and there's no timeline. And and to your point, it's just more of like not making it like marrying to this idea, which I'm always on the fence. I'm curious what you think about it. So I'm always on the fence with this idea that we have to be like, so like, people say like you got to give it your all and you got to focus, but personally, like I cannot just do one thing. I'd be bored out of my mind. I need to wear different hats.
100%.
It's what makes me
Yep.
creative, like in my work.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that? Like, people are like advising like you need to be, focused, and that's how.
Yeah. Yeah. So here is where I will just plug a separate part of my life, which you know about, but for the listeners who don't, so I during this entire journey, this entire process, I started reading a ton of self-help books and just asking myself, like, how can I be happier? Why am I'm in this Hollywood career, I'm making progress, like, why am I not happy? What's wrong with me? I have everything that I'm told I need to feel happy, so why am I not happy? And I started reading all these self-help books, and eventually I started a podcast where I summarize, my co-host Lisa and I summarize the most popular self-help books in the world and give our audience, the main points of the book um, in 45 minutes to an hour, because I wish that podcast had existed so that I knew, is this book worth my time? Is it not? And so I preface what I'm about to say with that because um, through a ton of those books, I started to realize that hustle culture is something that we all are swimming in and we don't even realize it. So it's kind of like if you're not monetizing every single gift you have, what are you even doing? Like if you're working your day job and paying your bills that way, but you happen to have a great singing voice, it's like, well, why are you not putting your singing videos on TikTok? Like it's almost like every single thing we do, we have to document, we have to show success, we're just entrenched in this. And I just want to reframe a couple of things that I've learned through all of these self-help books. And the first thing is that giving it your all can look like resting. Giving it your all can look like taking a step back, because we need something called radical downtime in order to let our brains sort through all of the stimuli and the input that we've received during the day, all of the ideas we've had, all of those things. And radical downtime is downtime that you have without watching, listening, or having input of any kind outside of yourself. So radical downtime can look like staring out the window. Radical downtime could look like journaling, as long as it's only your own thoughts. So if you're thinking like, I'm going to have radical downtime, I'm going to put a podcast on in the background, not radical downtime, right?
Mm,
Music can help as long as there's no lyrics. But basically, we have to give our brains the chance to go into something called default mode network. And it's the state of being, if you're ever standing in a checkout line and you kind of zone out, and then you're like, oh my gosh, it's my turn to check out. I didn't even realize. Your brain just went into default mode network. And what happens if you're hustling all the time and you're working full time during the day, and then you've got your side hustle on the weekends, and then you're constantly, listening to entrepreneurship podcasts to try and figure out how to improve yourself. If you don't give your brain radical downtime every day, 15 minutes a day is even super helpful. Your brain will force you into it.
mm.
So, Elena, have you ever experienced like you've been going, and you're on deadline and you have to say edit an episode of the podcast, right? And you just can't concentrate. Like your brain keeps going
Yeah.
off in another direction. Yeah. your brain is now forcing itself into default mode network. And so this is all to say, in our current society, rest is a radical act. And
Mm,
there are many reasons. I want to I guess I want to caveat that I believe it's toxic anytime we're like, okay, well, let's rest in order to be more productive.
mm,
Like, rest can just be this for the sake of rest. But as a recovering highly productive person, toxic productivity person, it really helped me to start to step into rest when I saw it as a means to an end for more productivity. But I just want to reframe that: you having weekends, you zoning out and watching TV, you taking the time you need to exercise or to take a walk outside, that that is going to give you more capacity for innovation. That is, as you've already said, going to make you more productive and fruitful. And I just want to remind everyone that it's not about how many hours you work,
mm,
it's about the quality of the output. So if, for example, when I was writing, if I wrote for an 8-hour day, I might only have 40 minutes of really brilliant writing. So, me sitting there for another 7 hours and 20 minutes trying to like pull something out of me, it's not about the amount of time that you spend, it's about the quality you're providing. Um, so these are all kind of positive reframes that helped me set aside a little bit of that hustle culture, set aside this idea, this really capitalistic idea that we've got to be going on all cylinders all the time, because your other job, other than starting your business, other than paying your bills, your job is to enjoy life. Whether you believe we are reincarnated, whether you believe that this is our only go around, your job is to enjoy the food on your plate, to smell the flowers that you're walking past, to listen to the birds chirping. Like, that is as important
mm,
as living into your purpose, starting a $1 billion business. And you can do both. They're not mutually exclusive. But I think we forget that, like, there's our jobs that we do to survive, and then there's the jobs we have as humans.
mm. I think you're spot on like we don't need to earn rest. And I think that's such an important message. We feel like we have to earn to rest. And it's like, and my
Mhm.
partner is very similar to that. And I always have to tell him, like, I'm like, once a week, we're just gonna do nothing. Maybe we'll do some kind of activity like workouts. We like to do that, but no work related stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that. And he'd be like, but I just feel so guilty. I feel like I'm not where I want to be. I'm like, nothing is going to happen if you take a day rest. Like it's not the end of the world. And
Yeah.
important, like you said, especially in the world of self-help books. And I've read so many of those in my as well, and I still do, and I enjoy them very much. And what I've started to recognize is that depends on who you kind of follow and listen to, whether it's podcasts or books. Like everybody has different advice, and you're like, so, and there can be complete opposite views. And if you don't give yourself space to say, what do I want to take from this? Maybe I'm not gonna. Maybe I don't.
Mhm.
This point is not relevant to me, but I feel like this point, this author made or this podcast made, might be relevant to me. So that way, we're not judging the creator, because you also have to understand where that person's coming from, and it may or may not be relative to how you think or your experience. So I think giving that radical downtime to let your mind just like, okay, what's good for me? Because a lot of times
Mhm.
we have that. We just don't give ourselves time, and we're consuming of information. It's like, and it just becomes messy, and then we don't even know what's the right way, and then we just follow like advice, which may or may not be the best way for us. And another thing I wanted to mention that you made is that what, hold on, I lost my track of thought. It will come back to me in just a second. My mind went the other way. But one of the things that you mentioned, what was it? It's gonna come back to me. It's important. Um, anyway, it's gonna come back to me. We're gonna let that one go. Oh yes,
No problem. Do you
no,
want me to
it's
help
back.
jog your memory?
It's back.
Okay.
It's back. It was around sometimes just letting go and not being so obsessed. And I believe that I see it work in my life, and this is purely personal experience. But I tend to, when I'm super like tunnel vision, it almost backfires on me. And when I've learned to just relax and just to say, you know what, I'm doing the best that I can, I'm taking the right steps, I'm progressing, and how I get to my destination, whatever it may be, is how I'm gonna get there. And it works, and I get to those places. Could I have gotten to these places faster? Maybe. I don't know, because I'm not so much like, so kind of strict with myself around that. And I think what it created for me is that I relax in a way that if I'm on my way towards a certain goal, I don't neglect opportunities that might be here because I don't have that tunnel vision anymore. So my vision kind of expanded. And so whatever I'm trying to achieve, opportunities might come from different sides. And I wouldn't have noticed them if I didn't give myself that radical downtime as you talk about, if I didn't give myself space to just let things be, let things evolve as they do. With some control to it, and effort and hard work. And I'm a huge believer on that. But I think just taking a moment and be like, let me just let it flow as well. And I think not creating that resistance is important.
Totally. And, you know, it's also so much easier said than done. Like people used to tell me, well, Misty, rest, take a weekend off, and I would, Saturday morning would come and I'd be like, okay, I cleared my schedule. And I would want to crawl out of my skin. Like I couldn't rest. And I just want to call that out for anybody else who struggles with that. I mean, like I created a podcast in my spare time, that that produced 2 episodes a week. We currently have almost 300 episodes, like that's the kind of pace I would go at in addition to working full time and other self-development and all those things. Um, but so that's just to say, like, I have needed the support of mentors or friends reflecting back at me patterns or offering, alternative ways to think about things. And something that's really helped me, um, a reframe that's really helped me in what you were just talking about, like relaxing and letting life unfold, is to just get curious. Because I think I used to put a lot of expectations, like, okay, this job has to accomplish this, it's got to get me to this next pay level or this next skill set or this next step on the ladder. And kind of stopping, taking a few deep breaths even before I like take a new job or as it's happening, going, I'm really curious. Like, I'm really curious. Let me get curious about where I could end up, or will I like this, or how do my coworkers do things? And kind of just pulling back a little bit to 30,000 feet so I could see the whole forest instead of just the one tree I'm trying to climb and
Right.
stare at. Um, really helped me to relax a little bit. And so I would even say to myself, like, get curious, stay curious, because it's not easy if you've been living in a way where you're trying to control every aspect of what you're doing, to just relax and chill out and see what happens. It takes a lot of practice. So I just want to call that out for anyone who's like, but I'm trying and I'm frustrated. Like, you're doing everything right. We don't break habits and patterns overnight, and it can take a long time. Um, but if you're even able to, for those of you who are listening to this, I'm making 2 really tight fists. If you're able to, like, even just like loosen your grip just a little bit. It doesn't mean your hands are like relaxed and doing jazz hands, but just to go from gripping so tight to like, my fingers are not cramping anymore, when it comes to how tightly you're holding on to your
Mhm.
career, the outcome of anything you're working on, um, can be a really beautiful thing.
Mm. And so, out of all the self development books, I know you have a podcast around. I look forward to listening to it, and I'm definitely going to share it in the podcast notes. But do you have any, like, what's the best advice you've heard out there that you feel like the worst? And in your opinion, obviously, we're not judging, but just in your opinion, have you had some, like, when you read, you like, this is ridiculous? Like, why would I even like?
Yeah. Yeah. So the crazy thing about self-help is that it spans everything. I mean, it spans money, careers, relationships, spirituality, manifesting. Like, my co-host Lisa always jokes that The Secret and Excel for Dummies are both considered self-help. So it is this wild, vast, totally unregulated sector of thought and philosophy and commerce. It's like a $13 billion a year business. I mean, it's crazy. So I always say, like, well, my self-help recommendations depend on the category you're talking about, but I really love Brene Brown. I love her book, The Gifts of Imperfection.
Mhm.
That was a book that really not only validated kind of the struggles I was going through, but also offers why being imperfect and embracing and working with our shame and our failures can actually be a superpower, and tolerating discomfort. Um, and I think the worst side of self help, and this is where Lisa and I on the podcast really really feel good about the fact that we can help our audience kind of as their gatekeepers, kind of the people who are like clearing the path with our machetes before they walk down it. A lot of self-help is victim blaming.
Mhm.
So they'll say, well, you don't have the career you want because you're not thinking the right thoughts. Or you got cancer because you thought thoughts of cancer. And that's where I'm like, no, 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 no. Like,
That's
absolutely
a good
not.
point.
I,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it's really, I would just say, really pay attention to your gut instincts. If you're reading a book and you're feeling worse about yourself when you're putting the book down, after a chapter or two, pay attention to that and remember that you do not have to listen to everything. Just like you were just saying, you can cherry pick the
Mhm.
advice that works for you. But there's one book that we make fun of a lot that and by the way, we do recognize that these authors are doing the best they can and they are trying to help. Nobody sits down and thinks, I'm going to put terrible advice that harms people into the world. um, but we do like to hold them accountable and call them out when they miss the mark. But there's this one book, it's called The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. And he talks about, you should only take jobs when they're in your zone of genius. And so turn down a $50,000 job, if it's like, hey, we'll pay you $50,000 to write this proposal for 1 month. If it's not in your zone of genius, turn it down. And we're like, absolutely not. You are not. This is coming from like a rich white man's perspective, like this does not apply to like a single mother of four. She can't just like turn down,
Exactly.
a job because it's not in her zone of genius. So, yeah. So we just try to hold people accountable and bring in some inclusivity into the self-help genre.
Yeah, and I love it. I mean, I'm really excited about listening to more episodes, and I think it's just such a cool podcast because somebody needs to just filter and I love it that you guys also you have that comic side to it. So and
Yeah.
you don't take yourself too serious, and I love that and these topics because they can be very heavy, and I think it's good to approach it from that little bit of a light perspective. So I very much appreciate that, and definitely going to share that with the audience. So where do you hang
Yeah,
out
thank
usually
you.
on social media? If people just want to follow you or get in touch with you, just kind of uh,
Yeah, absolutely. So, so where you can find me is posting like 2 pictures a year on Instagram. So if you want those thrilling updates, I'm at Misty Rose on Instagram. But really, the meat of my work is in my podcast. It's called Go Help Yourself, a comedy self help podcast to make life suck less. And we do approach self help. It does get very real and very serious, but we do approach it through a lens of comedy and play because laughter makes the medicine go down. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. So I'm not on Twitter. Our website is Go Help Yourself Podcast. And if you go helpyourselfpodcast.com. And we are also, well, we are on Twitter at GHY Podcast, but really you can get in touch with me or Lisa at gohelpyourselfpodcast@gmail.com.
sounds good. Thank you so much. Thanks for being guest. Thanks for sharing your story, and I look forward to having another chat sometime.
Thank you so much, Elena.